Richmond, Virginia, 1864. The candles are lit, the silverware is polished, the table is set. Elizabeth Van Lew moves through her dining room on Church Hill with the ease of a woman who has been hosting Richmond's finest for 20 years. She knows how to pour wine without rushing. She knows how to ask a question that makes a general feel like the most interesting man in the room. She knows how to smile at exactly the right moment, and how to say nothing when nothing is the most useful thing. Her guests tonight are Confederate officers. They eat her food and drink her wine and talk, the way men who feel comfortable always talk. Freely, carelessly, the way men talk when they are sure they are among friends. She listens. Every name mentioned, every unit discussed, every complaint about supply lines and missing reinforcements and the stubborn difficulty of holding the Petersburg line. She listens to all of it with the warm, attentive expression of a gracious hostess who seems to have no concerns beyond making sure everyone's glass is full. Within 48 hours, what these men say at her table is in a dispatch traveling toward Ulysses S. Grant's headquarters. She has been doing this for 3 years. She will keep doing it until the war ends, and not one person at her dinner table has any idea. A lot of behind-the-scenes work goes into every script, animation, and edit you see here. If you're enjoying the results, hit subscribe to join the journey. It's the best way to support the team. Also, dropping a like tells us exactly what kind of history you want to see next. Let's jump back in. Elizabeth L. Van Lew was born in Richmond in October 1818 in a house on Church Hill that looked out over the city and the James River below. Her father, John Van Lew, came south from New York to make his fortune in hardware, an unromantic business that builds quiet, durable wealth. Her mother, Eliza Baker, came from a prominent Philadelphia family. Together, they gave Elizabeth something unusual for a Richmond woman of her generation: roots in the North and a mind shaped by the assumptions of two different worlds. The Van Lews owned enslaved people. That has to be said clearly because it complicates the easy version of Elizabeth's story, the version that makes her a pure abolitionist heroine who never benefited from the system around her. She grew up in a slaveholding household, in a slaveholding city, in a slaveholding state. She was part of that world before she decided to act against it. But her parents also sent her north for her education. She attended a Quaker school in Philadelphia, run by people who did not share Richmond's careful justifications for slavery and our peculiar institution. She came back to Church Hill carrying something the city could not see but would never quite shake out of her: the conviction that what passed for normal at home was wrong. By the 1850s, she had quietly freed the enslaved people her family held. She bought freedom for relatives of those people when she could. She helped arrange educations for some of them in the North. She gave money to churches and schools that taught black Richmonders to read, in defiance of state law and local custom. Her neighbors saw a pious, charitable, somewhat eccentric woman from a good family, generous with money, involved in church work, occasionally odd in her opinions. They did not see danger. When Virginia seceded from the Union in April 1861 and Richmond became the Confederate capital, Elizabeth Van Lew made a decision almost no one in her social circle made. She stayed loyal to the United States. Not quietly loyal, not in the way of private Unionists who kept their thoughts to themselves and rode out the war in silence. Loyal in a way she was prepared to act on, at real personal risk, for as long as it took. She was 42 years old, unmarried, living in a large house on Church Hill with her mother and her brother. She had no military rank, no official authority, no formal protection beyond her social standing and whatever cover she could build. She decided that would be enough. Down the hill from Church Hill, near the James River, a brick tobacco warehouse had been converted by the Confederate government into a prison, Libby Prison. It held Union officers captured in the first years of the war from Bull Run, from the peninsula, from scattered skirmishes all over Virginia and beyond. Men who had been leading regiments and brigades were now crammed into rooms never meant for human beings, overcrowded, badly ventilated, fed on rations that kept them alive, and not much more. Elizabeth Van Lew had an idea. She went to Confederate John Winder, the officer responsible for Richmond's military prisons, and requested permission to visit Libby as an act of Christian charity. She and her mother, she explained, wished to bring food, clothing, medicine, and religious tracts to suffering men, not as partisans, but as devout women of good family moved by compassion. Winder agreed. Think about what just happened. A Unionist woman has obtained official, documented access to the primary Union officer prison in the Confederate capital. She has Confederate permission to walk in and out of Libby carrying baskets and bundles whose contents no one is going to search in detail, because the whole purpose of the arrangement is to let her bring things in. She puts that access to work immediately. The baskets get false bottoms, the food containers get hollow spaces. Books she brings in for religious comfort have thin slips of paper pressed into their bindings. Clothing donations are altered to conceal notes and small items. Going in, the baskets carry more than charity. Coming out, they carry information. Notes from prisoners about troop movements and unit identities they observed before capture, descriptions of Confederate officers and guards, requests to contact families or comrades in Union lines, sketches of the city's defenses. She helps arrange for sympathetic people to be placed on the prison staff, orderlies, clerks, guards, who can look the other way at key moments or pass small items back and forth. She smuggles civilian clothes into the prison, giving officers a chance to vanish into the city if they can get out of the building. In February 1864, 109 Union officers escape from Libby, tunneling out through the prison's basement and emerging blocks away. It becomes one of the most famous prison breaks of the war. Accounts differ on how central Van Lew's role was. What is clear is that her network's contacts, signals, and supplies helped make escape a realistic option instead of a fantasy. Then there is Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren, a 21-year-old Union cavalry officer killed during a failed raid on Richmond in March 1864. His body publicly displayed and secretly buried by Confederate authorities. Van Lew's network located the grave, dug up his remains under cover of night, and moved them to safety until they could be sent north for proper burial. That was not intelligence work. It was something more personal, an act of loyalty to people her city had already decided were enemies. By late 1863, rumors had reached Union lines of a mysterious Unionist woman in Richmond who visited prisons, helped prisoners escape, and seemed to have eyes everywhere. In December 1863, General Benjamin Butler, commanding at Fort Monroe on the Virginia coast, made contact with Van Lew and formally recruited her as a paid Union intelligence agent. That changed the nature of what she was doing. Before this, she had been an individual acting on her conscience, improvising. After this, she was part of the Union's emerging intelligence system, with a handler, a cipher, deadlines, and priorities. She began to systemize what she had already been doing. Instead of passing along bits and pieces opportunistically, she built a network, roughly a dozen core members at its height. Not just friends, but carefully chosen people with access, opportunities, and the ability to keep their nerve. Clerks in the Confederate War Department and Navy Department who handled orders, reports, and troop movement papers. Quartermaster and ordnance workers who saw supply levels and shipment destinations. A former candidate for Richmond mayor who moved in political circles. Formerly enslaved people connected to her household and to others who moved between white households and offices largely unnoticed. She developed her own cipher, a substitution code simple enough to use in a cramped room by lamplight, complex enough that a Confederate officer who intercepted a note would see only nonsense. She wrote on thin paper, tore messages into strips, and hid the strips in the false bottoms of baskets, in hollowed-out eggs, in layers of cloth. She experimented. Which routes were safer, which couriers could be trusted, how far she could push her access at Libby and other prisons, when to risk a message, when to hold it back. Information began to move regularly from Church Hill to the peninsula and from there to Union headquarters. Sometimes Van Lew sent her reports wrapped around Richmond newspapers so Union commanders could read what the Confederate press was saying and compare it to what her sources said. Sometimes she literally sent flowers to Grant, and with intelligence tucked in among the stems. A bizarre detail, unless you remember that she has been a hostess her entire adult life and understands that the most suspicious object in a war zone can be the one that looks exactly like a polite gesture. By early 1864, she is no longer just a unionist doing what she can. She is a professional spy operating behind enemy lines, feeding the man who is going to end the war. The single most extraordinary element of Van Lew's operation is not in her house at all. It is in Jefferson Davis's. Among the people Elizabeth Van Lew had freed and helped educate was a woman historians usually identify as Mary Jane Richards, later often called Mary Bowser. Van Lew arranged for Mary to be placed as a domestic servant in the household of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Pause on that for a second. A Union agent in Richmond, working out of a house on Church Hill, manages to position an operative inside the Confederate White House itself. In the building where Davis lives, works, reads his dispatches, meets with generals, and decides strategy. Mary's role in that house is what all domestic servants' roles were supposed to be: invisible, present without being seen, moving in and out of rooms, clearing tables, delivering messages, hanging coats, all the things that quietly keep a 19th century household running, performed by people the owners are trained not to notice. The people in that house believe, to the extent they think about it at all, that Mary cannot read. Virginia law tries to make sure of that. Teaching enslaved or formerly enslaved black people to read is illegal. The entire system rests on the assumption that black intelligence is either absent or safely contained. In reality, Mary Bowser is literate, highly intelligent, and, by all indications, has a near photographic memory. Van Lew has helped her get an education, possibly even sending her north at one point. Now she is in Davis's house, in the heart of the Confederate government, pretending to be exactly what they think she is, incapable of understanding what passes under her hands. She watches, she listens. She sees Jefferson Davis reading dispatches. She hears fragments of conversations between Davis and his generals. She gets glimpses of orders and reports as she dusts a desk, clears a table, carries something in or out. What she could physically copy or note down, she does. What she cannot safely touch, she memorizes. Then she passes what she knows to Van Lew. Van Lew encodes it, hides it in eggs or baskets or folded cloth, sends it out by courier, and it moves through Confederate lines to Union intelligence. Follow that chain. A decision is made in the Confederate White House. Mary hears it or sees documents about it. She carries it in her head to Church Hill. Van Lew translates it into cipher and sends it south and east. A Union courier rides with it to Grant's staff. Grant reads it while planning operations outside Petersburg and Richmond. Jefferson Davis's own household is generating intelligence that helps bring down the government he leads. We do not have a neat list of Mary told Grant X, therefore Grant did Y. That is not how intelligence history works. What we have are overlapping testimonies, post-war recollections, and the steady, consistent picture that emerges. Davis had a spy in his house, and that spy's reporting flowed through Van Lew's hands. Mary Bowser is one of the least remembered figures of the Civil War. She is also one of the most important. By 1864, with Grant commanding all Union armies and hammering south toward Petersburg and Richmond, Van Lew's operation is running at full capacity. Grant is investing Petersburg, the rail hub whose lines feed Richmond. It will be a long, grinding siege, not 47 days like Vicksburg, but 9 months. The lines extend for miles. The fighting is constant, local, brutal. From his headquarters, Grant needs answers. How many men does Lee have in front of him at specific points? Which divisions are being shifted from one sector to another? What is the state of Confederate supplies inside Richmond? Are civilians desperate yet? Are politicians panicking? Does Jefferson Davis intend to hold the city at all costs, or abandon it if the lines crack? Cavalry raids and scouting can tell you some of that, but not all. They can count campfires, interrogate prisoners, read landscape. They cannot tell you what is being whispered in the Confederate War Department or what Davis said to his cabinet yesterday. Van Lew's network can. Her reports flow to Colonel George H. Sharp, Grant's intelligence chief, the man building the Union's first true professional military information bureau. Sharp is not interested in rumors. He wants names, units, dates, document citations. He wants intelligence that fits into timelines and can be cross-checked against prisoner statements, intercepted telegrams, and scouts' reports. Again and again, Van Lew's reports hold up. She sends word of troops being moved in and out of Richmond. She reports changes in Confederate fortifications. She passes along details of supply shortages and morale that show up later, independently, from other sources. After the war, Sharp will say that the greater portion of his reliable Richmond intelligence during the final campaigns came from Elizabeth Van Lew. Grant is not making decisions in a vacuum. When he orders attacks, redistributes his own forces, or assesses how long Lee can hold out, part of the picture in his head comes from a woman pouring wine in a Richmond dining room and a black servant carrying plates in Jefferson Davis's house. None of this would have worked if Richmond had taken Elizabeth Van Lew seriously. It didn't. It called her Crazy Bet. The nickname did not come from nowhere. Van Lew cultivated it. Over the course of the war, she made a deliberate choice to seem a little unhinged in public, to behave in ways that made people dismiss her as an eccentric spinster rather than fear her as a political enemy. She muttered to herself in the street. She dressed oddly at times. She made pointed, sometimes strange-sounding remarks in company. She gave money to causes and people her neighbors thought inappropriate. Respectable Richmond ladies shook their heads. Poor Miss Van Lew, always a bit peculiar. Respectable Richmond men smiled and filed her away under harmless. This was the cover. Too conventional, and Confederate counterintelligence might have looked more closely at the devout woman of good northern connections who visited Libby Prison suspiciously often. Too obviously subversive, and she would have been arrested outright or placed under heavy guard. The Crazy Bet Act threaded the needle. Eccentric enough that people stopped listening closely to what she said. Respectable enough that they did not see her as an immediate threat. In the fall of 1864, Confederate investigators actually targeted her in an inquiry into leaks from Richmond. They came to her house, they asked questions, they probed. Then they concluded she was probably not the main problem. They knew intelligence was getting out of the city. They knew several someones were feeding the enemy. They looked at the slightly odd, unmarried churchwoman on Church Hill and decided it cannot be her. The persona had worked. Think about what that cost her. She was not crazy. She was, in fact, running the most effective intelligence operation in the Confederate capital. She was keeping a dozen people coordinated, fed, and safe. She was designing ciphers, managing couriers, reading the city's politics, and gauging risks in real time. Every time she acted off in public, she was deliberately letting neighbors think less of her so they would not think about her at all. The city's contempt was her camouflage. She paid for her safety with her reputation on purpose, and she kept paying that price day after day in a city she knew, among people she had grown up with, right up until the morning it no longer had to be paid. On April 2, 1865, Federal assaults finally cracked Lee's lines at Petersburg. That night, the Confederate government evacuates Richmond. On April 3rd, Union troops enter the city. The evacuation is a mess. Confederate troops set fire to tobacco warehouses and other supplies to keep them from Union hands. The fire spread. Flames move through parts of the business district. Smoke rises over the capital of the Confederacy as the army that defended it marches out. On Church Hill, the woman the city has called Crazy Bet for 4 years goes to a hiding place in her house and pulls out something she has kept secret since 1861. An American flag. Not a scrap, not a little ribbon. A full-sized flag she has hidden through house searches, through visits from suspicious neighbors, through the comings and goings of couriers and spies. She has kept it rolled up out of sight while Confederate banners flew over the Capitol and every public building. She walks outside and raises it. For the first time since secession, the stars and stripes fly openly over that house on Church Hill. Neighbors see it. Some of them have lost loved ones in gray uniforms. Some of them have just fled burning streets. Some of them have called her crazy for years. Now they see what she actually is. It is the moment when the mask comes off. A few days later, Ulysses S. Grant comes to Richmond. He is the conquering general now. The man who took Vicksburg, broke the siege at Chattanooga, destroyed the Confederate position at Petersburg, and has Lee's army on the run. He comes up to Church Hill and visits Elizabeth Van Lew. They have tea. The general, who depended on her reports, sits in the parlor of the woman whose neighbors thought she'd lost her mind, and they talk as equals, co-workers in a sense, from different sides of the lines. In 1869, President Grant appoints her Postmaster of Richmond. The appointment is also a message. The man who ended the war is telling the ex-Confederate capital that the woman they called crazy is someone the United States government trusts with its mail, its money, and its authority. Richmond does not take that well. The war ends. Reconstruction begins, then falters. In Richmond, the post-war story of the Confederacy begins to harden. The lost cause, with its talk of noble defeat, states' rights, and gallant gentlemen in gray. Statues go up, streets are named and renamed. Public memory tilts toward honoring the generals who lost, not the people who stayed loyal to the Union. Where does Elizabeth Van Lew fit in that story? She doesn't. To the people building the lost cause, she is not a complicated figure. She is a traitor. A woman who sided with the enemy, who betrayed her city, who helped defeat her neighbors. The fact that the enemy she sided with was the United States does not matter to them. She becomes socially radioactive. Invitations dry up. Some neighbors turn their backs. Others tolerate her as an awkward fact. Someone they cannot quite erase but will not publicly acknowledge. She is still a Van Lew, still from a prominent family, still living in a large house on a prominent hill, but the warmth is gone. Day to day, that rejection doesn't look dramatic. It looks like conversations that stop when you approach. It looks like once friendly shopkeepers becoming curt. It looks like pews shifting at church. It looks like a shrinking world. When Democrats retake state and local power and Reconstruction ends in Virginia, she loses the postmaster's job. The salary disappears, the staff she hired is replaced. The small pocket of federal leverage she used to open doors for black Richmonders closes. Running a spy network for years had cost her money. For couriers, for supplies, for bribes, for equipment. The federal government never fully reimbursed her. Her appeals to Washington after the war bring small sums, delayed. She begins to sell things: furniture, family heirlooms, silver, pieces of the life the hardware fortune had once made comfortable. Northern friends, Union veterans, abolitionists, people who know what she did, send money quietly. She accepts it. The woman who risked her life to serve the Union now survives, partly on the gratitude of Union men who remember. In Richmond itself, the monuments rise. Statues go up to men who once sat at her table and talked freely, never realizing their complaints about supplies and reinforcements were being encoded and sent to Grant. She walks past those statues and goes back to the house on Church Hill that still holds the flag she raised on April 3rd, 1865. She does not leave the city. She does not apologize. She has already spent a lifetime pretending to be someone she isn't. She will not perform remorse for people she believes were wrong. Elizabeth Van Lew dies in Richmond on September 25th, 1900, at 81 years old. She dies in the city of her birth, the city she undermined for 4 years, the city she helped save for the country it tried to leave, the city that never forgave her. Her grave in Shockoe Hill Cemetery is, for years, barely marked. It is Union veterans and Northern admirers who eventually raise money for a monument. The woman who ran the network that kept Grant's headquarters informed while he broke the Confederacy's back lies for a long time in an unremarkable plot, while the hills around her grow crowded with towering stone tributes to the men she helped defeat. In 1993, 93 years after her death, the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Corps inducts her into its Hall of Fame. Historians of intelligence, who care about ciphers and sources and networks and effects, look at the record and tend to the same conclusion. She was the most effective Union spy in the Confederate capital and one of the most effective agents produced by either side in the entire war. Those honors matter, but to understand her, you have to go back to smaller scenes. Back to the dining room on Church Hill where she pours wine for Confederate generals and asks them how the Petersburg line is holding up while remembering every detail. Back to Libby Prison where she walks in with baskets of food and walks out with hidden notes. Back to Jefferson Davis's house where a black woman clears plates, hears secrets, and carries them in her head to an address on Church Hill. Back to the Richmond street where a middle-aged woman mutters to herself so her neighbors will write her off as Crazy Bet and stop looking at her closely enough to see what she is doing. Back to April 3rd, 1865, when she finally pulls the flag out of hiding and lets the city see who she has been all along. What did she buy with all that? She did not buy comfort. The war left her poorer and more isolated than she had been at its start. The country she served took decades to acknowledge her. The city she tried to save did not, in any meaningful sense, thank her. What she bought was something more abstract and harder to measure. A Union army that knew from inside Richmond how strong its enemy was and how weak. A general who could make decisions about Petersburg and Richmond with better information than his opponent had about him. A living demonstration that not everyone in the Confederate capital believed in the Confederacy. Even then, she bought at the cost of her reputation the ability to use the powers her world gave her. Wealth, race, class, and gender, against the system that had created them. The woman Richmond called crazy built the pipeline that carried Jefferson Davis's secrets to Ulysses S. Grant. The woman Richmond called a traitor helped end the war Richmond was fighting. The woman Richmond shunned died nearly alone in the city she helped defeat, while that city raised statues to her former guests. A century later, military intelligence professionals and historians finally put her where she belonged, in their pantheon. Richmond took longer. You could argue it still hasn't quite caught up.